This plant replaces sugar, not as a metaphor, not as a marketing claim. The roots taste genuinely sweet, crisp, clean, refreshing, and the compounds creating that sweetness pass through your body without raising blood glucose. Glycemic index, 40. Table sugar, 65. White bread, 75. This plant sits well below both, and still tastes sweet. 18 months ago, a neighbor handed me some rhizomes. Older man, grew things most people have never heard of. Plant them, he said. Cover them, leave them. I had no idea what they were, so I buried them in the worst corner of my garden. Compacted soil, no care, no plan, and I forgot about them completely. Literally forgot. No water except rain. No compost. Nothing. The months passed. Autumn arrived, and then I remembered. I walked down to that corner expecting nothing. Dead stems, maybe bare soil. I had not thought about that strip of ground since spring. What I found stopped me cold. The plants were enormous, 6 feet tall, 7, nearly touching the fence on the other side. Broad, dark leaves, each one the size of a dinner plate, had formed a canopy so dense that not a single weed had pushed through beneath it. Not one. The ground underneath was bare, dark, slightly damp, shaded out completely since midsummer. I had walked past this spot dozens of times, never once looked properly. That is the level of attention this corner had received from me. I stood there for a moment, just looked. Then I dug. I loosened the soil around the base of the first plant, worked carefully underneath, and eased the whole root system free. What appeared from the earth were large, amber-colored, torpedo-shaped roots, each between 20 and 30 centimeters long, heavy, smooth-skinned, dense in a way that surprised me before I had even lifted them clear. Nothing like what I expected from something I had essentially abandoned 8 months earlier. I pulled them free one by one and laid them in the grass beside me. Then I started counting. Then I stopped counting and started weighing. 20 pounds. From one forgotten plant. I set them out on the ground and stared. I am not someone who gets emotional about harvests, but I photographed everything before I moved anything else. I wanted proof. Not because I thought anyone would disbelieve me, but because I barely believed it myself. 20 pounds, neglected soil, no fertilizer, no watering beyond what fell from the sky. One growing season of zero intervention. I carried the basket inside. The roots smelled faintly of soil, and faintly of something sweet, before I had even washed them. I rinsed one, dried it, and peeled back the skin with my thumbnail. It came away easily, thin and amber, like the skin of a peach. Underneath, pale, almost white flesh, glistening, dense with moisture. I cut a slice. Then I tasted it. I had not expected that. It does not taste like sugar. It does not taste like anything that comes from a packet or a bottle. It tastes like something further back, simpler, like biting into a very ripe pear pressed against cold melon. Sweet and clean and almost hydrating. Crisp in a way that snaps cleanly without resistance. No heaviness, no aftertaste. The sweetness arrives, dissolves, and before you have fully registered it, you want another piece. I called my children over. I handed each a slice without telling them what it was. They ate it, asked for more. My youngest looked toward the kitchen, assumed I had brought fruit in from somewhere, and reached for another piece. I did not correct him. Here is what I kept returning to, standing at that counter with a basket of roots I had not watered deliberately, had not planned around, had barely thought about since planting. 20 pounds. From a strip of ground I had written off before the season even started. No inputs, no attention. One afternoon in spring, burying some rhizomes in bad soil because a neighbor pressed them into my hand and I had nowhere better to put them. Gardeners say a good crop gives back more than you put in. I have used that phrase myself. But it does not quite cover what happened here. Because what I put in was almost nothing. And what came back was 20 pounds of something that tasted better than anything I had bought at a market all summer. That was the moment I understood this plant was different. Not just productive, not just effortless. Different in a way I did not yet have an explanation for. Why does something this sweet not behave like sugar in the body? Why have so few gardeners outside the Andes ever found it? Why does a plant this easy, this generous, remain almost entirely unknown? Those answers were coming. But standing at the counter with a slice of something that tasted like fruit and grew like a weed, I did not need them yet. 20 pounds. From a corner I forgot about. That was enough to start. Here is what makes no sense. The last decade produced an entire industry around functional foods, gut health, sugar alternatives, natural sweeteners, low glycemic eating, billions of dollars in product launches, hundreds of brands, thousands of articles, all built around one idea, something genuinely sweet that does not wreck your metabolic health. Yacón does exactly that, quietly, without a marketing budget, without a celebrity endorsement, from a neglected corner of a garden if necessary, and almost nobody outside the Andes knows it exists. Yacón has been cultivated across Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Colombia since before the Inca Empire. Centuries of consistent use. Generations of farming communities that valued it, not as a novelty or a supplement, but as food. Everyday food. Reliable, productive, sweet food that grew without complication in high-altitude soil. It has stayed there. Here is the irony. While supplement companies were extracting Yacón into capsules and syrups and selling them in health food stores, premium prices, tiny quantities, long lists of health claims, the actual plant was sitting in Andean farming communities, doing the same thing for free, in the ground, the way it has for 500 years. Now consider what else came out of the same mountain range. The potato, the tomato, the pepper, quinoa, amaranth. Every one of those plants left the Andes, crossed oceans, and permanently reshaped global food culture. The tomato rebuilt Italian and Spanish cooking. The potato became the fourth most widely grown food crop on the planet. Quinoa went from an Andean staple to a global health food trend in a single generation, driven by nothing more than the discovery that it had properties people were looking for. Yacón has those properties. It has had them for centuries. It has not made that journey. It is still waiting. What I keep returning to is this. Yacón is not waiting because it has nothing to offer. It is waiting despite offering almost exactly what that entire functional food industry spent the last decade trying to engineer in a laboratory. 3 things worth understanding clearly. The first is the sweetness. Real sweetness, not the apologetic, muted version most sugar alternatives produce. Yacón tastes unmistakably sweet. But the primary carbohydrates behind that sweetness are not absorbed by the upper digestive tract. They do not convert to blood glucose. They pass through completely intact. That is why the glycemic index sits around 40, well below white rice, white bread, most commercial fruit juice. It tastes like it should spike your blood sugar. It does not. The second is what those carbohydrates do once they reach the large intestine. They do not go to waste. They become fuel for beneficial bacteria. The strains linked to better metabolic function, lower inflammation, improved digestive health. The bifidobacterium, lactobacillus. The sweetness feeds your microbiome instead of your blood glucose monitor. Research teams in Peru, Japan, and Brazil have studied this for decades. A food that tastes sweet and simultaneously supports your gut bacteria is not something that shows up in any garden catalog I have ever read. The third is how it grows. Put it in the ground, leave it alone, come back in autumn. That is the method. No weekly attention, no pest treatments, no complicated watering schedule. The canopy grows tall and dense enough to shade out competing weeds entirely. Once established, it handles moderate drought without visible stress, and at the end of a season of zero intervention, it returns 20 pounds of food, from a corner most gardeners would not bother planting. Those 3 things together, a sweetener that does not spike blood glucose, a food that feeds beneficial gut bacteria, a crop that produces serious yields from complete neglect, should make Yacón one of the most widely grown plants in home gardens worldwide. It is not. Most people watching this have never tasted it, never grown it, possibly never heard the name before today. That is not a niche problem. That is a failure of information, because this plant is not hard to grow, not hard to find, and not hard to eat. It is just unknown. And unknown is not the same as unavailable. That gap is what this video is here to close. Smallanthus sonchifolius. That is its scientific name. Asteraceae family, same as the sunflower and the artichoke. Not a starchy tuber, not a root that stores energy as glucose the way a potato does, something molecularly different. And that difference explains everything. It comes from the Andes. Elevations between 1,000 and 3,000 meters, mild days, cool nights, consistent sun, well-drained mountain soil. A climate that shaped a plant with a specific survival strategy, store energy not as starch, not as simple sugar, but as long-chain carbohydrates that survive the Andean dry season without breaking down. That same molecular durability is what makes them pass through the human digestive system intact. The climate shaped the chemistry. The chemistry is why you are watching this video. Now, the roots. There are 2 types. This is the most important thing to understand before your first harvest, and the mistake almost every first-time grower makes. At the base of the stem, clustered just below the soil surface, are the propagation crowns. Reddish-brown, compact, knobby. These go back in the ground next spring. They are not food. Do not eat them. Below those, hanging deeper, larger, lighter in color, amber on the outside, white inside, are the storage tubers, heavy with moisture, dense. These are what you are after, sweet, crisp, and completely different from what sits just above them. I pulled out my first harvest, grabbed the closest root, and tasted it. Fibrous, hard, unpleasant. I nearly wrote the entire plant off. I had not. I had tasted the wrong part. The storage tubers hanging further down are an entirely different experience. That distinction matters. Remember it before you dig. Now, the sweetness. It does not come from glucose. It does not come from sucrose. It comes from compounds called fructooligosaccharides, FOS, long chains of fructose molecules linked by a chemical bond that human digestive enzymes cannot break, cannot cleave, cannot process. The FOS moves through your mouth, your stomach, your small intestine, completely intact, unabsorbed, without entering your bloodstream. That is why the glycemic index sits at 40. Not because the sweetness has been diluted, not because something is missing, because the molecular structure of that sweetness is fundamentally unlike anything else you are likely to grow. Table sugar converts to blood glucose almost immediately. Yacón's primary carbohydrate never does. It passes through the upper digestive tract as if it were not there, but it is there, and the large intestine knows exactly what to do with it. When those undigested FOS chains reach the colon, Bifidobacterium and Lactobacillus, two bacterial strains consistently linked to better metabolic function, ferment them as a primary fuel source. That fermentation produces short-chain fatty acids, butyrate, propionate, acetate. These lower the pH of the colon, suppress the growth of harmful pathogens, and improve mineral absorption. In plain terms, the sweetness does not just pass through your body harmlessly. It feeds the bacteria responsible for your metabolic health while it does so. Research teams in Peru, Japan, and Brazil have tracked this seriously for decades, studying effects on gut microbiota composition, insulin sensitivity, body weight, and glucose metabolism in people managing type 2 diabetes. I am not calling it a cure. The clinical picture is more complex than any headline can hold, but the mechanism is not complicated. A food that tastes unmistakably sweet, does not raise blood glucose, and arrives in the large intestine as fuel for beneficial bacteria. That is, in the most literal sense, a sugar that behaves like a vegetable. This is where people expect the catch, the complicated step, the hidden reason something this productive must require real effort. There is no catch. Start with the crowns. What you plant are the propagation crowns, the reddish-brown, knobby clusters sitting just below the stem base at harvest, the part you set aside instead of eating. They look like a compact ginger root, darker, knobbier. Each crown carries several small, pale buds on its surface. Those buds become the shoots. One properly planted crown becomes a plant nearly 2 meters tall by the end of summer. If you are starting for the first time, source crowns from a specialty grower in your region. Mainstream nurseries will not stock them. Yacón is still too uncommon for that. But once you have crowns, you will never need to buy them again. One mature plant produces between 10 and 20 crowns at harvest. Within 2 seasons, you will have more than your garden can absorb. People give them away. I give them away. That is how this plant spreads. Not through commerce, through gardeners pressing rhizomes into each other's hands. Plant in spring, after the last frost. Not before. Yacón tolerates cool soil, but frost kills emerging shoots before they harden off. Wait until night temperatures stabilize and the soil carries some warmth. Dig a hole 20 centimeters deep. Place the crown buds up. Cover with soil. That is the entire process. No pre-soaking, no hormone treatment, no propagation medium. You put it in the ground and step back. If your soil is reasonable, not compacted, not waterlogged, with decent structure, no amendments needed at all. If the soil is genuinely poor, a moderate amount of mature compost at planting helps. But do not overdo it. Excess nitrogen pushes Yacón toward foliage, at the direct expense of root development. You end up with a spectacular canopy and a deeply disappointing harvest. The plant responds to overfeeding the way most neglect-tolerant plants do. It grows tall, grows leafy, and forgets what it was supposed to be doing underground. Balance beats excess here, every time. Give it room, at least 1 meter between plants. I prefer 1.5 meters. This plant does not grow modestly, it grows aggressively. By midsummer, a healthy Yacón reaches between 1.8 and 2 meters. The canopy spreads wide, leaves the size of dinner plates, overlapping, forming a dense wall. At 1 meter spacing, two adjacent plants compete for light and root space before the season is halfway finished. That height is not a problem. It is an advantage. Plant Yacón along a fence line or at the back of a border and it builds a dense green screen by mid-July, blocks wind, creates shade, looks from a distance like something you planned deliberately for ornamental purposes, with the difference that in October, you dig it up and pull 20 pounds of food out of the ground. Water less than you think. Yacón descends from the Andean highlands, erratic rainfall, well-drained mountain slopes, months without consistent moisture. It carried that drought tolerance with it. Once established, I water once per week during summer at most. In a season with reliable rainfall, less than that. In spring and early autumn, rain handles it entirely with no input from me. The comparison that clarifies this: tomatoes, cucumbers, crops that punish you with blossom drop and bitter fruit the moment moisture becomes inconsistent, that demand weekly attention from planting straight through to harvest, that require a gardener actively present and responsive all season. Yacón sits at the opposite end of that spectrum entirely. One genuine exception: sustained extreme heat. If temperatures hold above 35 degrees for several consecutive days and the leaves begin to droop in the afternoon, water it, not on a schedule, as a direct response to what the plant is showing you. It will signal when it needs something. Until that signal arrives, leave it alone. That is the hardest part of growing Yacón. Not the planting, not the spacing, not the soil, the restraint. Everything in a gardener's instinct says something this productive must need more from you. It does not. The restraint is the method. Autumn arrives. Yacón tells you. The leaves yellow from the bottom upward. The stems lose their rigidity. The plant that spent 6 months driving energy skyward reverses direction, pulling everything back down into the roots, loading the last weeks of the season underground. It looks like decline. It is not decline. It is the plant finishing its work. Your job is to wait. Wait. This is where impatience costs you. Yacón roots continue developing and sweetening right up until the plant has fully died back above ground. Harvest too early and you pull roots that are smaller, less developed, noticeably less sweet than they would have been with 2 more weeks in the ground. The plant is doing something in those final weeks. Let it finish. If your climate delivers a light frost, wait for it. Frost accelerates the process. The plant reads it as the final signal to push every remaining resource underground. No frost in your climate? Wait until the above-ground portion has completely collapsed and withered on its own. Either way, the rule is the same. The plant above ground must be finished before you touch what is below it. The method: cut the stems at ground level first. Use loppers or a pruning saw. By end of season, the stems have thickened considerably and will not yield to a clean hand cut. Clear the debris from the base so you can see the soil surface cleanly. Then pick up a digging fork. Not a spade, not a shovel, a fork. This is not a minor preference. It is the difference between a clean harvest and a damaged one. Yacón storage roots are fragile for their size. The skin bruises and splits far more easily than a potato. A spade blade moving through autumn soil cuts roots cleanly in half before you realize what has happened. A fork loosens soil without making direct contact. Work it in a wide circle 30 centimeters out from the stem base, around the full circumference, then ease the tines underneath and lift the entire mass upward in one slow motion. What appears from the ground is the 2-tier structure every Yacón grower eventually learns to love. At the top, the propagation crowns, reddish-brown, compact, clustered at the stem base. Below them, the storage tubers, heavy, amber, glistening, hanging in a cluster like something placed there deliberately while you were not watching. Separate them carefully by hand, crowns in one pile, tubers in another. Stand there for a moment. It is always more than you expect. The mistake I made: first harvest. I carried everything inside, filled the sink, washed every root clean, and packed them neatly into storage boxes. Organized, thorough, satisfied with myself. 3 weeks later, I had lost nearly half to rot. Here is the counterintuitive truth about Yacón storage. Soil protects them. The thin layer of earth still clinging to the skin after harvest acts as a buffer. It slows moisture loss, prevents the skin from degrading prematurely, and keeps the roots stable through weeks of storage. Washing removes that buffer entirely. The exposed skin then sits in cool, slightly humid, enclosed conditions, precisely where rot establishes itself fastest. Store them unwashed. Leave whatever soil remains on the skin. Pack them loosely into wooden crates or slatted boxes in a cool, dark, well-ventilated space. A shed, a basement, a cool corner of the garage. Wash only directly before eating. Since making that change, I have lost almost nothing to rot. The propagation crowns need separate treatment. Pack them into barely moist peat or sawdust in a frost-free space through winter. They hold condition reliably until spring planting, and a single plant produces between 10 and 20 crowns at harvest. Store more than you think you need. We will come back to why that matters. Start raw. Peel back the thin amber skin. A thumbnail does the job, no peeler needed, and what is underneath is pale, almost white, dense with moisture. Cut it into sticks the size of carrot batons. That is your baseline. Everything else is optional. One practical note: Yacón oxidizes fast once the flesh hits air. Not dramatically, but within 10 minutes the white flesh dulls at the edges. Same behavior as a sliced apple. Same fix. Cold water, a few drops of lemon juice, cut pieces in immediately. Color holds. Crispness holds. As a snack. Cold, straight from the water, dried on a cloth. The texture sits between a water chestnut and a ripe pear. Firm, snapping cleanly when you bite through. The sweetness arrives and dissolves without residue. No heaviness, no aftertaste. Refreshing in a way that does not make sense for something that sweet. Hand a piece to someone without naming it first. They will assume fruit. Nobody guesses root vegetable. My youngest reached for a second piece before I finished explaining what it was. I let him. That is the best endorsement I have. In a salad. Roasted beetroot, toasted walnuts, goat cheese, or sharp feta if that is what you have. Yacón alongside all three. That combination works for a specific reason. Each component is doing something the others are not. The Yacón brings clean, watery sweetness. The beetroot brings depth and earth. The walnuts bring bitterness and body. The cheese pulls everything into balance with salt and fat. Yacón's sweetness is light enough that it does not compete with any of it. It lifts. Start there before you experiment with anything else. For something simpler, apple, carrot, Yacón, sharp vinaigrette. The acidity cuts the sweetness without eliminating it. Add fresh ginger if you want more presence. Cooked, yes. Roasted with olive oil and rosemary, it softens and deepens. Stir-fried alongside other vegetables, it rounds out sharper flavors with background sweetness. Both work. Neither is the best use of this plant. Here is why. Heat degrades phos. The chains responsible for Yacón's low glycemic behavior begin breaking down under sustained cooking temperatures. Prebiotic function diminishes. Glycemic load rises as FOS converts to simpler, more rapidly absorbed sugars. Cooked Yacón is still good food, but it is no longer doing the specific thing that makes Yacón worth growing. The gut benefit goes. The blood glucose advantage narrows. Eat it raw if those properties matter. Cook it however you like if flavor is the only goal. The syrup. In the Andes, there is a tradition of boiling the roots, extracting the juice, and reducing it into a thick, dark sweetener, somewhere between light honey and thin molasses. Commercially, Yacón syrup has reached health food shelves. Low glycemic sugar substitute. Premium price. Tiny bottle. I made it once from my own harvest. Complex flavor. Slightly mineral. Genuinely interesting. The process took most of a day. Juicing, straining, reducing over low heat, until it finally thickened enough to pour. I have not made it since. Eating it fresh is better in every measurable way. Faster. No cooking, no hours at the stove, no FOS degradation. Peel it, drop it in lemon water, eat it. That is the whole process. One warning. If this is your first time eating Yacón, start with around 50 grams. The FOS content is high. A gut unaccustomed to that concentration of prebiotic fiber will make its objections known, audibly, at an inconvenient hour. Start small. Give your gut a week to adjust. Increase from there. I did not do this. I tasted something extraordinary, ate without restraint, and spent that same evening reconsidering every decision I had made. The lesson required no repeating. If it tastes this good, grows this easily, and does what the research says it does, why does almost nobody grow it? Here is what I have concluded. The first reason: nobody knows it exists. Outside the Andes, Yacón simply does not appear in the cultural food vocabulary. No common name that stuck, no mainstream moment, no agricultural campaign that introduced it to home gardeners the way heritage tomatoes or purple sprouting broccoli found their audience over the last 20 years. The loop is self-reinforcing. You cannot ask for something you do not know exists. If nobody asks, no nursery stocks it. If no nursery stocks it, the next person who might have grown it never gets the chance. Nothing about the plant explains the obscurity. The obscurity explains itself. The second reason, commercial logistics. The roots are fragile. The skin bruises under mechanical harvesting. They do not stack and move through a supply chain the way potatoes do. Uniformly shaped, robust, tolerant of compression, forgiving of rough handling, even carefully packed, Yacón arrives at a distribution center in worse condition than it left the farm. Shelf life compounds the problem. Stored correctly, Yacón holds for months. But that storage requires specific conditions: controlled temperature, adequate ventilation, handling that protects the skin at every stage. A potato can be thrown in a cellar and ignored for weeks. Yacón cannot. For a commercial chain moving hundreds of thousands of units through warehouses and refrigerated transport, those requirements create a margin problem most buyers will not accept. Compare it to the sweet potato. Ships well, stores reliably, sits on retail shelves for weeks without visible deterioration. Mature supply chain, efficient logistics, established demand. Yacón has none of that infrastructure, and building it from scratch requires a commercial demand that does not yet exist to justify the investment. Another closed loop. But here is the thing. None of that matters to you. Those limitations, fragile skin, specific storage requirements, the complexity of moving volume across distribution networks, are problems that exist entirely at a scale you will never operate at. You are not running a supply chain. You are not moving pallets through a warehouse. You are carrying a basket from your garden to your shed. The constraints that make Yacón commercially impractical dissolve completely at the scale of a home grower. You harvest it, store it unwashed in a cool corner, eat it across the following months. The supply chain is your garden path. The distribution network is the distance between your shed and your back door. A problem that defeats an industrial operation becomes irrelevant when the grower and the consumer are the same person standing in the same kitchen. That gap between what makes a crop viable at commercial scale and what makes it worth growing at home is where Yacón lives, and it is an enormous gap. Most of what constrains a plant in a commercial context simply does not apply when the distance from harvest to table is measured in footsteps rather than freight miles, and when the goal is feeding a family rather than satisfying a retailer's margin requirements. For self-consumption, Yacón is almost perfect. That is not a consolation, that is the point. What I cannot fully account for, even after the awareness gap, even after understanding the commercial impracticality, is why home gardeners have not found it in larger numbers. Because home gardeners are exactly who this plant was designed for. The effortlessness, the yield, the absence of pest pressure, the tolerance for neglect, those are not incidental properties. Those are the features that matter most when you are growing food between other obligations, in whatever space you have, with whatever attention you can spare. Yacón fits that life precisely. Most plants do not. That corner of your garden you gave up on, the strip too awkward for tomatoes, too narrow for anything with real ambition, too forgotten to bother planning around. Put Yacón there. That is not a consolation. That is precisely where it performs best. Neglected soil, afterthought spaces, patches that never made it onto the planting plan. Yacón finds those corners, fills them, and by October you will be standing there with 20 pounds of something sweet in a basket, wondering what you wasted that space on for so long. Start with 4 or 5 crowns. That is enough. No dedicated bed, no amended soil, no complicated watering plan. You need a shovel, an afternoon, and the discipline to leave the plants alone once they are in the ground. Water during extreme heat. Otherwise, step back. The season does the rest. One last thing. When you harvest, and you will harvest more than you expect, keep more crowns than you think you need. First season, I pulled the crowns, counted what looked reasonable, and stored them. Sensible, measured. I thought I understood how the plant multiplied. I did not. By spring, several had dried out despite my best efforts. I planted with fewer than planned. The second harvest was smaller than it should have been. Not from anything that went wrong during growing, but because I undersupplied myself at the very start. Now I keep everything I can, pack them into barely moist sawdust in a frost-free space, through winter, count them in spring, plant what my space holds, give the rest away. That last part matters more than it sounds. Every crown I hand to a neighbor, to a friend, a fellow grower, someone curious enough to ask about the enormous plants crowding my fence line, is another garden where Yacón takes root. Another person who will stand somewhere in October with a basket in their hands and that look on their face. I recognize it. I wore it the first time I weighed a harvest, and the number did not seem real. That is how plants like this spread, not through supermarkets, not through commercial campaigns or product launches or viral moments, through one person pressing something into someone else's hands and saying, plant this, leave it alone, come back in autumn. A vegetable that replaces sugar, 20 pounds from a corner you forgot. Both of those things are real. Both are available to any gardener willing to put 5 crowns in the ground and step back. If this is the kind of content you want more of, forgotten crops, underused plants, food with a history worth knowing, subscribe to Rootwise HQ. This is what we do here. And bring someone with you. Yacón deserves more gardens than it has. That much is not complicated.